Hello, fellow cardboarders! Welcome back. I've mentioned this deck multiple times throughout my videos on my channel, and today is finally the time we're gonna look at the Kamahl Fist of Krosa Premodern deck. We're gonna look through every card in detail and find out how strong a pre-modern EDH deck can actually be. Without further ado, this is another installment of Think Outside the Deck box, and here is Kamahl Fist of Krosa in German for you. For 6 you get a 4/3, I think human druid he's today, and he has 2 activated abilities. For 1 green we can turn a land into a 1/1 creature, any 1 land actually, which is also kind of nice, and keep that in mind that this exists. But the most important effect on this card is the overrun effect, which for 5 gives all creatures +3/+3 and trample until end of turn. Overrun is not in the deck because it's on my commander, and we're gonna play him when we're about to win the game. And Overrun would be a redundancy piece if we don't have the ability to cast our commander, but we want to activate it multiple times, which is why Overrun is not in this deck. But of course you can play it if you want to. Now the idea of this deck is play a whole bunch of elves, pump them up, and beat your opponent's face. So it's pretty straightforward, but there are some pretty interesting cards in here. Cards you might have not seen yet in an elves deck if you like playing elves. And maybe this gives you some inspiration, or maybe even I inspire you to build your own pre-DH deck. I've split this deck into 8 or 9 categories. So we have the ramp pile, the removal pile, a card draw pile, a recursion pile, a tutor pile, a untap pile, token pile, a bonk pile, and the lands, which are utility lands and basic lands. So let us first check out the ramp pile. We have Finthorn Elves, which just add 1 mana, similar to the Line of War Elves. Both of them 1/1 creatures, tap for 1 green. Skyshard Ranger ramps us in the sense that we can tap it to just put a land into play. Solid effect. Elvish Pioneer does it once. We put 1 land from our hand onto the battlefield tapped. Then we have Wood Elves, which searches our library for a forest card and puts it into play. If we didn't play pre-modern, this could also fetch for shock lands. Keep that in mind. Any duels that have the land type forest can be fetched with that one. Birchlore Rangers allows us to tap any of our elves for mana. If we tap 2 of them, we add 1 mana into our mana pool, and it has Morph, which we're never gonna use actually, so most of the time we just play it for 1. Elvish Guidance gives us mana when we tap the enchanted land for each elf we have in play, and there are actually 3 of them that do that. So 2 more elves that do that. This one is relatively cheap compared to that one, the Channeler, and the Elvish Guidance. These are both for 4 mana, and they all tap for the amount of elves I control in the color green. So most of the time, or many times, we're gonna fetch for the Priest of Titania because it's really good, cheap in mana, and brings us so much further. We also play Chaos Touch, which allows us to play an additional land. Has to be a basic forest. We play enough of them, over 20 in number, and we can at any point also sacrifice this enchantment to add the 2 mana that we paid for it later in the game. Earthcraft, one of the more expensive cards. Pre-DH decks are more expensive since we are restricted to cards from Alpha to the set before 8th edition. So anything in the old frame can be, original old frame can be put into this deck, and Earthcraft is one of them. We are restricted to cards, so we're gonna play every expensive card if they're good enough in there. And it allows us to tap any creature to untap a basic land. Therefore, similar to the Birchlore Rangers, it allows us to tap creatures and get mana from them. This one has to tap 2, this one just has to tap 1 creature to get a mana. And then lastly we have Crop Rotation, which for example could fetch for the Wirewood Lodge, which untaps an elf. There are a couple of more utility lands that we can fetch for, so we are gonna sacrifice a forest to get the best land in our deck. The removal pile. There are a couple that remove artifacts like the Elvish Scrapper. We also have Crumble that does the same and gives some life back to our opponent. Seeds of Innocence gets rid of all artifacts on the battlefield. We're playing a couple, but most of the time this will not hurt us as much as it will hurt our opponent when we destroy all their treasures and giving them 0 life points back for them. Then we have the Elvish Lyrist, which destroys an enchantment. Tranquility also destroys all enchantments on the battlefield. Another board wipe. Therefore, Naturalize can destroy either artifact or enchantment, while Chain of Acid allows to destroy any permanent on the battlefield, and our opponent is allowed to do that to us or anyone else on the battlefield for that matter. So maybe you can find a deal and get rid of more stuff, and then there's a chain going until no one wants to destroy anything anymore. Desert Twister simply destroys a card, any permanent on the battlefield, for 6 mana at sorcery speed. So it's bad, I know, but we are very limited in Premodern, so that's the best I have found that just without any downside destroys any permanent in green. Keep that in mind. Night Soil, interesting unknown card. For 2 you get an enchantment, and for 1 you can exile 2 creature cards from any graveyard, and you get a 1/1 sapling. You can do that as many times as you find creatures in graveyards. Maybe you even want to exile your own ones for some value. And keep in mind, with Kamahl we want to have a whole bunch of creatures on the battlefield that we're all going to pump up. So this could also go into the token category if you want to see it as that, but I also saw it as removal in the sense of graveyard hate. Hall of Gemstone is an interesting card in the sense that it is some mana hate. So at the beginning of each upkeep, the player whose turn it is chooses a color, and then all mana taps for just that color. So even your opponent's mana, so if it's your turn and you have a control player, they only have green mana at that turn probably. And your opponent, who maybe plays multiple colors, has to find a strategy to just play with 1 mana from then on. So that's a really unique card, and yeah, I like to use that from time to time. This is our only real board wipe that can manage creatures except for flyers, deals X damage to each creature. And now you remember that you can turn your opponent's lands into 1/1s as well. So even if you just pay 1 and a green and a whole bunch of green to turn your opponent's lands into 1/1s, yeah, it can be quite devastating destroying all their lands. So yeah. Yeah, we want to play some mean cards. And if we can, we're going to do that. So, Mishra's, I think, Helix. For 5, you get to pay X and tap it to tap X lands. So at first, it's kind of underwhelming, but we're also playing Seedborn Muse in this deck. Let's see if I can find her. Yeah, there she is. In German, though. I'm going to show the translation again. And at the beginning of each untap step, we're going to untap all permanents, including the Helix, including all our mana. And now the idea with those 2 on the board is that at the beginning of the upkeep of our opponent, we're gonna tap all our mana to tap all our opponent's mana, and we're gonna do it for each opponent. So they only have mana during their upkeep, they're able to cast some instant, and that's it. They draw a card, have no mana left, and then they are gonna pass the turn. We're gonna untap with all our mana and with the artifact and do that to the next player. So this can be very mean, and it is a way to lock out the game and just deal with our opponent's permanents that are on the battlefield from then on. Card draw pile. Compost, a card that I think more players should play. For 2 you get an enchantment that allows you to draw a card whenever any black card is put onto an opponent's graveyard from anywhere. So most of the time you have a player that has black cards in their deck, maybe even 2 players, and you're going to draw a whole bunch of cards for just 2 mana throughout the game. Fecundity allows you to draw a card whenever a creature leaves the battlefield into their graveyard. This applies to each opponent, so if you have a big sacrifice deck that you're playing against, maybe you don't want to play this card during that game. Well of Knowledge and Howling Mine, both of them allow a kind of social interaction here, similar to the Fecundity, even though you don't want to play socially since it can be abused quite a bit. But this one allows to draw an extra card, and this one also allows to draw an extra card for any player who wants to tap 2 for each card they want to draw. And there are not many green card draw cards in Premodern, so this is the best we found. We also have the Multani's Acolyte, which once draws us a card and then probably dies, or we keep it around to beat our opponent. Sylvan Messenger, when it enters, we look at the top 4 cards. Most of the time it finds 1 or 2 elves and we put them into our hand. Gamekeeper I put here since I couldn't find a better category. This one replaces itself with a creature that we find on the top of our library, so if it dies, we exile it, we reveal cards from our library until we find a creature and put that into our hand. Not the best card, could be replaced, but an elf is an elf. Sylvan Library, most people know. If you don't, just stop the video and look at it. But what we want to do is actually pay a whole bunch of life points to draw a whole bunch of cards, since we have some life gain abilities and we don't mind being at like 20 or like 15 life points, since we are normally the threat with the huge creature army. Slate of Ancestry, speaking of creature army, we tap 4 and the slate, discard our whole hand, so most of the time we're going to use it when we don't really have anything left in our hand, or just 0 cards, or 1 or 2 that we don't need anymore, and then we draw a card for each of our creatures. If we have like 4 or 5 creatures, this is already a big upside. Bloodline Shaman, we tap it, we choose a creature type, so elf most of the time, all of the times, and we reveal the top card. If it is an elf, we put it into our hand, otherwise we put it into graveyard. I whiffed a couple of times. You could imagine if like 1/3 of our deck is elves, yeah, like every 3rd card is a trigger that we actually hit, and sometimes good cards fall to the graveyard, and yeah, it kind of sucks. But we have some recursion plan in our next pile, so it doesn't hurt too much, but it kind of sucks. Greater Good allows us to draw a whole bunch of cards for the power of a creature that we sacrifice, and it's also a great combination with Fecundity. If we can sack creatures now, we can draw even more cards. And then we have to discard 3 cards. So if we have a 10/10, we can sack it, draw 10 cards, discard 3. Book of Wrath allows us to, at any time, pay 2 life, pay 2 mana, and draw a card. Solid, not too strong, but great in Premodern. Collective Unconscious, I think, might be the strongest card draw here, next to Greater Good probably. It allows us to simply draw a card for each creature for 6 mana, probably already known. And then Abundance, where I also didn't know where else to put it, since it doesn't draw an extra card, but it filters out cards. So we choose non-land or land, and we either need a land and we draw until, or we look at the top card until we find a land and put it into our hand. Or if we choose non-land, we reveal cards until we reveal a non-land and put it onto hand. So this one can be quite critical throughout later in the game, when we really need no lands anymore, or, well, maybe we need a land at some turn, and we are able to filter out with Abundance. Now, more interesting, I think, is the combo of Abundance and Sylvan Library, before I forget, because if I understand correctly, you can draw 3 cards and you can choose 3 times what you want to see, and you can actually filter out the cards on top of the library. If they're like 2 lands and, I don't know, a creature, you can filter out 3 times non-land, and you put the top 2 lands into your graveyard, under your library, and then you get 2 fresh cards on top of the Sylvan Library through the Sylvan Library and the top creature that was on there. So that's a really neat interaction, I think, because sometimes you're stuck with cards that you don't really want, and then you're kind of forced to pay 4, which often sucks. So yeah, keep this interaction in mind. Also for not Premodern decks, because I think it's not really known that you can do that. Recursion. Revive allows us to get back a green card into our hand. Reclaim puts it on top of our library, any card, not only green cards. This also puts any card into our hand from our grave. Then we have the Soul Tiller, which refills our library actually. So if it dies, we can choose a creature type, Elves, and we can put all Elves from our graveyard back into our library. Genesis gives us a trigger at our upkeep, during each of our upkeep, and we can pay 3 to put any creature card back into our hand. And this I like as a little surprise. It doesn't really recur, but it lets us stay a threat. So if someone wipes the board, since we are a threat, and then we flash Collar of the Claw onto the battlefield, we actually get a 2/2 bear for each creature that dies this instant. And yeah, then we just cast Kamahl and probably beat our opponents with bears. Then if we have like 10 creatures, that's already 20 damage, and boosted with Kamahl, this gets out of hand real fast. So don't underestimate Collar of the Claws. I think it's a beautiful card in this deck. Tutors! This is the strongest tutor in this deck, I think. Sky Shroud Poacher, which tutors for any elf and puts it onto the battlefield for just 3 mana. And we will filter out our deck and get the strongest elves that we can find turn after turn. And there are untappers, as you've heard. So, for example, this combo is brutal with the Seedborn Muse. Being able to get 4 elves throughout 1 turn cycle simply by having both of them on the battlefield is amazing. Wirewood Herald. When it dies, we get an elf into our hand from our library. Natural Order, we sack a green creature to get a green creature onto our battlefield. And Survival of the Fittest allows us to filter our hand from, at that point, useless creatures to get more useful creatures into our hand to be able to cast them. Untappers. Seedborn Muse, you already know and already heard. Strong card in this deck. Nature's Chosen, probably not as known. For 1 green, you enchant a creature. So most of the time a mana dork, or maybe this poacher, since it's also quite important. And you are able to untap it for 0 mana, which you can only use during your turn. So you get 1 extra untap and 1 extra ability, or maybe once more mana. Mana pile is in here. Where is that guy? Here, for example, the Channeler, and you get double the elf mana that you would get normally. The second ability we can ignore since it only applies to white creatures, stronger in white and green decks then. Quirion Ranger. For returning a forest, we can untap a creature, and sometimes we don't draw a forest and we can just replay it, or we don't care, and we can actually do it during each of our opponent's turn if we really want to. And again, untapping a creature can be quite powerful, for example, in the sense of mana or poacher, you name it. Wirewood Symbiote allows us to return an elf, so we maybe get a triggered ability back into our hand, or maybe we can save an elf from a board wipe. And yeah, we untap an elf and we can poach again, or you name it. Seeker of Skybreak taps to untap a creature, most of the time. Mana dorks, any tappers that you found important throughout the deck so far. Emerald Charm does it once, but it's also versatile in the sense that we can destroy any global enchantment, any enchantment that is not an aura, or any creature loses flying, and then we can actually remove it with Hurricane as well. Where did we put that? This one. Next up, token creators. There are 4 of them. The Hive Master is one I like to tutor for, since it's giving me insect tokens whenever any non-token elf enters, and more creatures means more mana, means more damage, and that's just great. Deranged Hermit gives me 4 squirrel tokens, also boosts them, so I might want to keep him around, or might want to put him back into my hand, you know, and then just recast him next turn, or the same turn, so this can get out of hand real fast as well. Voice of the Woods, it's like a big boy. Like, for 5 elves that you tap, you get a 7/7 elemental with trample. It's a Timmy card, but I found it funny. I also have it in foil, and if you have like 10 elves, this can get out of hand real fast as well. With these Seedborn Muse on the board as well, you can untap all your elves again and get more elementals, and then yeah, this can get strong, you know. But it's not the best card in this deck. Squirrel Nest is a combo card in this deck with Earthcraft that you saw earlier. Let's get this into the camera for a moment again. With those two, you can actually create infinite scroll tokens that can attack next turn. So yeah, your opponents have to deal with any of those cards or wipe the board, and I mean, if you play Caller of the Claws. So yeah, I found it funny that you can actually play this combo in pre-modern EDH. So now let's lastly look at the bonk pile before we look at the utility lands and the amount of basic lands that we're playing. And I hope you enjoyed this video so far. This is Kaisa for 5. You get a 2/3 that boosts all green creatures, all the tokens that we create throughout the game. I really find this artwork beautiful. It's an alternative, weaker commander to this deck if you wanted to swap them out. But yeah, Kamahl is so much better. Sad that he isn't an elf, but yeah, what can you do? Another booster that bonks or lets your team bonk harder, gives them all Forest Walk and +1/+1. Coat of Arms, most of you probably already know, gives +1/+1 for each other creature that shares a type with the creature. So if you have like 10 elves, all your elves get +9/+9, and so on. Timberwatch Elf gives one elf a big boost. If we untap it, this can get out of hand again as well. Elvish Herder, I think it is in English, gives trample for just 1 green. If we don't have our commander out and maybe we get a creature to like, let's say like 10 or so, we can give it trample. You could swap it out for any other elf if you don't think you need it and want another tutor like Worldly Tutor in there as well, which I don't have. Taunting Elf is a lure on a elf body. It doesn't really bonk, but the rest of the creatures do if we attack, so everyone has to block it, and the rest cannot block my creatures. And if this is what is needed to win, we're gonna win like that. Concordant Crossroads is the card that gives haste in this deck, so maybe we build our board presence out throughout one turn and we want to attack or tap for mana. We can play Concordant Crossroads to even go further or, yeah, to kill a player. Well-Wisher, yeah, I'm sorry, this doesn't bonk, this protects from bonking. This is also the card that allows me to gain life to draw more cards with the Sylvan Library that you saw earlier here. But I didn't have another category where I want to put this, and the anti-bonk I kind of found fitting. Now lastly, let's see about the utility lands. Wirewood Lodge untaps an elf, so it could also go into the untapped pile. We're playing some land hate since we can, and people are playing strong lands these days, and being able to do that can be quite devastating. We're playing cycling lands to be able to replace them if we don't need them. A fetch land to just thin out our deck, not important actually, but I had it. Gas Cradle, it's the most expensive card in the deck and is a card I would try to fetch with the crop rotation that you saw earlier and get stronger with every token that you play and if you're able to untap this land. So yeah, it's great, obviously. This is why it's on the Game Changer list. Yavimaya Hollow, also a great land, allows you to regenerate any creature, and these days regenerate is an effect that we see rarer and rarer, and I think this land has been forgotten. It's on the reserved list, but maybe you want to own one copy to be able to save your green creatures in any of your green decks. Temple of the False God, I think in a mono green deck you can play this land, so I played it and it gives 1 more mana for 1 land. And then we play 24 basic forests. I put in snow-covered forests because they look beautiful. These I also count towards those, but we don't have an actual use for them. But now, I do want to hear from you. Which pre-modern commander cards did I forget to put into this Kamahl deck? Let me know if you have a pre-modern deck yourself or are inspired now to build one. Click those 2 buttons to support the channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye!